Hi, I'm Sharon Tavares, and thank you for joining us on The Antique Trader. And we're here at the Craftiques Mall on Northwest Military in San Antonio, Texas. And today we're going to be discussing comic books. And we're here with my guest, John Pick. John, could you tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm a student in a college. I'm learning how to become a historian. And on my spare time, I like to look at pop cultures, especially comic books, since they're a big, huge influence on the pop culture.
Okay. And you're just studying history right now?
For now, yes.
What do you plan to go on to?
I plan to go on a few things. One, to be like a historical researcher, track a few things down that historians are looking for, and once in a while maybe work for the film industries, try to give them a few cues here and there.
That's great. Okay, let's start with your good collection of comic books here.
Sure. So this first comic right here is the Spider-Man 3 miniature comic that came with the Spider-Man DVD. And it just gives you a little small story of what was going on between the bad guys and the heroes. And the character of the comic was not Spider-Man, but originally it was what focused on was Venom.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And why did you purchase this in particular? What attracted you to this particular issue?
Well, I was a kid at the time, and I really enjoyed picture books, so I thought, hey, this will be fun to read.
Oh, okay. Let's do the X-Force, and maybe you could tell us about that one.
Sure. They are kind of like, the best way to describe it, they're like the brother, I guess you could say the brother band of the X-Men. They're like the far division of them, and it takes place in the future. And their leader is Cable, who happens to be the son of Scott Summers, Cyclops.
Do you collect a lot of Marvel comics? Is it
yes.
particular?
Mm-hmm. Mostly from Fantastic Four to X-Men, Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Avengers, Captain America, especially since he was a big founding part of Marvel.
Okay. Could you tell us why in particular you purchased this particular issue?
Well, it's a funny story actually. A friend of mine he found out that I was interested in comics. And he had a few comics laying here and there and he didn't want to keep them anymore. So when I was in high school, he gave these comics to me because he knew I was a big fan of comics, especially for Marvel. And so he just gave it as a gift for me.
This particular one?
Yes. Well, actually, not only that one, but the next one as well.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at the next one and see.
Sure. Now, this one has like a small, triple crossover. You have the X-Men, Spider-Man, and members of the Avengers.
Okay. What does that mean? I wouldn't know because I'm not a comic book collector.
Sure. A crossover is when you have two characters from two separate stories coming together. Like, the best way I could describe it, let's say like if you have Superman meets Batman, they're the same people from the same universe, but they come from different stories. They come together to work together. Or in some cases, they fight each other. And for some fans of the comic book genre, they like to see some superheroes fight over each other to see who is greater than the other. Best example, Batman versus Superman. Although that the movie has been a little bit bipolar, it's still a lot of comic book fans were happy to see their favorite characters from the comics finally to become together on the big screen.
What do you mean by the movie being bipolar? That's very interesting.
Well, there have been a few debates by both the critics as well as the fans, like the director went a little bit too fast on the movie. The other thing was that they kind of blamed the studios themselves because they want to go a little bit rush faster. They want to compete with Marvel. Marvel and DC have been at odds with each other for the past almost 50 years by now. Ever since when they released their new superheroes like Superman or Batman and Captain America, at the beginning it was like a small friendly truce fight. Let's say like who will have more sales on that. And then within the 60s, they started to increase their characters and from the DC district. They increased new characters like Martian Manhunter, Cyborg. They made Robin into Nightwing. As well as from Marvel, they were trying to find a way how to compete back. So a man by the name of Stan Lee thought, how about we bring back some of our old characters who we used in World War II? And that was Captain America. Captain America, he was not used in the comics after the World War II was done. Because Captain America was like a propaganda comic to show like America could get through this war. After the war was over, more and more people want to focus less on the war and move on forward. So the writers decided to not write him anymore, and he was left mysteriously. Well, he mysteriously disappeared from the comic book genre history until the early 1960s, when Stan Lee, who was once worked with some of the comics, thought it would be a good idea to bring Captain America back, to bring those old families from the 40s back into the 60s.
I'm in awe. I'm amazed about your knowledge about this.
Thank you.
You said 50 years ago. How did you research your information?
Well, not only my research, well, I have to get credit to online, but as well you have to be sure that it's actual factual. So I went to some other comic book stores as well, personally myself. If you look at the beginning when Marvel decided to make their own movies instead of the studios like Sony or Fox making their own movies about their characters, they decided they want to take out this notch and they felt like, how about we be our own independent film company? With the help of Paramount, they released their movies like Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America. And at the beginning, everyone was laughing and thinking that, oh, this is kind of, well, for the film critics, they're like, this is the same thing over and over again. We've seen it with Spider-Man, X-Men, and even The Dark Knight. What can Marvel be doing that will make us think that they're doing something different? That all changed when, after Captain America and Thor came out, when they revealed that the movies like Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, and Captain America movie were all interconnected. A movie studios has never done that before, and the Captain America movie at the end revealed that all the characters you knew, Iron Man, played by Robert Downey Jr., Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, Captain America, played by Chris Evans, they were all going to be coming together into the movie playing their same character. This was something big. And after they released their movie, The Avengers, funny thing is that DC was finishing their trilogy of the Batman movie, The Dark Knight Rises. So they were like, okay, we finished with Batman. What can we do to compete with Marvel? I mean, now they're making, I don't know, about $1 billion from releasing that movie, just that movie. And before any other of the most great superhero movies came out before the Avengers, Avengers was actually in third place of being the top 3 movies that have grossed $1 million, behind Avatar and Titanic. So DC decided to up their competition by trying to increase their popularity by bringing all these characters. Superman, the Man of Steel movie, then finally bringing Superman back, but having a co-star Batman with it, Batman vs. Superman. And that's why some of the fans got upset, because DC was rushing things. And when the movie, instead of focusing on one storyline, they put multiple storylines into one movie. And that's why some of the critics and some of the comic book fans were going up against the other comic book fans who were saying that this was a great movie.
Are you guys listening? A tower of information. Okay, let's go on to the Avengers here.
Oh, sure. Now, that comic right there is kind of a little bit of an interesting but funny one as well. I only done a little bit of research on that because it's been a while, but I can tell you what's interesting about that comic. It shows that it has the character Jarvis in it. Jarvis originally in the comics was Tony Stark's butler. He wasn't the AI butler we know in the movies. The idea of him being an AI butler came out during the Iron Man cartoon show back in the 1990s. And on Jarvis, instead of being this butler like Batman had a butler named Alfred, Tony created this AI called Jarvis. And that was an interesting idea. The comic fans actually liked it because some of the other comic book fans were like, well, Jarvis and Alfred feel awfully familiar. You have Tony, a rich guy, Bruce Wayne is a rich guy. The only thing that makes them different is that Batman knows more crony and knows more about technology than Tony Stark himself.
So when you choose your comic books, very important thing. What are you looking for? The history? Are you looking for a particular one, or just something that captures your eye?
Well, that's the funny thing. I kind of use all three. It's not only the history I like, it's also the storyline as well. Like, what is the author trying to portray here? Is it for an interesting adventure story, a little bit comedic for the fans? And how has it changed the pop culture?
But what I'm saying is, when you go out, say, well, it's Saturday and I'm going to go out shopping, I'm going to go, look for comic books and whatnot. Is it something that just captures your eye?
Well, in ways.
Or is it something that you already have in mind that you're going to go find because you've read or researched it previously?
I want to say it's the first one. A little bit more is the first one because the comic books, the comic book industry, what they try to do to capture their audience is not only the storyline, but their amazing art style. because the art style is made by this one individual person back in the 1960s. It was all led by one individual artist. And the thing was that in the 60s, they actually had to draw. There were no programs. And the way they had to save it was to print it, actually.
Right.
And the original copy was safely stored somewhere. And the first issues were considered like that was the first print art.
Right.
Then the reprint, that's when the value went a little bit low, because in history, when you have something brand new, like it was first publicly published, it becomes very valuable. But when it gets reprinted, it's not as good as the original one.
Right. The other thing is, how do you know if I'm going to go purchase a comic book to give somebody as a gift, which one is original and which one isn't?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. That's a little bit grayish area for me, because sometimes now in today's comic book industry, they do put, let's say, this is the second issue, like this is a reprint.
Right.
In the original, sometimes you don't know if they were the reprint. There is a type of code that does say like this is a reprint or not, but still I'm trying to look for it. But I can tell you
this one doesn't have a code?
Well, looking at it, I will have to say no. It looks like almost like an original.
Okay. So if we look in the back, there is nothing that tells us about a code or anything, right? No.
Sometimes that's the tricky part, because in the back there would be either like, let's say like this was the publication date, or it's just advertisements.
So those, you would find that
somewhere on the top corner right here, around here.
Around here. Okay. So where the price is and whatever, it would tell you, it would give you a date.
Yes.
Okay.
But also you could tell by the date is by the comic book art style. I can say it's like, for instance, what you have right there is more of a 1980s type style, because how the artists were drawing back then. The Marvel comic book style back in the 1980s was like, it was a little bit brand new, but still had like the 1960 classic style. The 70s, on the other hand, was a little bit more
And what do you mean by the 60s style? What type of style was that? Was that more like the bubble lettering that when I was going to school, they used to do like bazooka bubble lettering or something like that? That type of thing?
Something like that, yes. That was more like late 1950s and early 1960s. But yes, it's something like that. The 1980s, what they were trying to do was they were either trying to go in a new direction of art style, or they were feeling a little bit nostalgic, saying it's been 20 years after the 60s. Maybe we could retry the art style by doing it our own way. Like how today, like a lot of people now are like, we are kind of down the 80s type of nostalgia. I mean, now we passed the 30-year mark for Back to the Future.
Right. Do you have any comic books that are actually black and white, that they go back that far? Do you have anything like that?
Sadly to say no. The only farthest one I have is probably around the 1970s.
Okay. Let's look at this. This is the man called Nova.
Oh yes, another interesting Marvel character. Nova is a superhero that has amazing powers, cosmic powers in fact. And he gets it from using his helmet. But the interesting thing is that Nova, you haven't seen Nova yet, correct? On the big screens, right?
No.
Well, pretty soon he's about to be on the big screens, but he's going to be played by a different character. Carol, sorry. Carol, and she's going to be called Ms. Marvel, and it comes out in 2018.
That's interesting. I'll tell you one thing about yourself. If you're not a father yet, you're going to be a great dad. They're going to love you. Your kids are going to love you.
Oh, thank you.
Great information. Okay. Spider-Man, my love.
Yes, definitely. That is the new Sinister Six right there. You have some of the Spider-Man's classic enemies like the Rhino, as well as like that right here is a classic one right here. He's Rhino. But these guys right here, they're kind of Spider-Man's 70s villains. You have the Beetle, you have, I can't remember his name, but I do know he's kind of like the opposite of Sandman. His powers is water. He can absorb, he can actually form into water. In fact, he became very popular back in the 1990s when he came on the Spider-Man 1994 cartoon show.
I see. How original is this one? How old is this particular one?
Well, by the looks of it, it seems to be in the 90s, because right here you see it shows us celebrating Captain America's 50th year birthday. He came out in 1941, and the year it was published was in 1991.
That's very interesting. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue with comic books. And my favorite, Spider-Man, probably. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back with Mr. Pick here, and we're discussing about comic books and the history of comic books. Tell us about this particular Marvel comic that you have here.
Well, the interesting thing about this comic right here is it's an Iron Man comic, and it's Iron Man's 30th anniversary. Iron Man came out in the 1960s, so since it's its 30th anniversary, this came out in the 1990s. And what's interesting is that Iron Man, he was popular, then kind of lost track, then became popular, lost track again, and finally now he's popular again. During the 1960s, Marvel was having some talks with some TV producers, and they thought, well, since DC is having their own shows, we would like our own shows. But they were kind of on a low budget. So what they decided to do was they decided to tell the story like through comic book pages, but in our style, like Disney style, and a low budget. If you go to YouTube and you can see some of the old 1960s Marvel TV shows, you're gonna laugh because they just look like paper mache that's moving by being just simultaneously on just pictures. But what's interesting is that for this guy right here, the art style is more for the 1990s Iron Man cartoon show, Iron Man. And what's interesting is that Iron Man, he was popular during the 60s when he was with the Avengers. But then after the 70s, he kind of lost popularity on TV until the 90s, when Marvel was like, hey, we have enough money now, we have our own little small cartoon production studios, let's try and bring back some of the old ideas, some of the old characters. So they thought, well, let's bring back Spider-Man because he's still very popular, which they brought out the 1994 series. Let's try and bring out the Fantastic Four because, hey, we now have enough budget to bring some of the characters that were famous back a while back. And let's try and bring in some characters that some people have forgotten, like Iron Man.
Now, let me ask you a question. I'm sorry that I have to stop you.
No, it's okay.
But I see that a lot of the comics that you bought here, are you collecting particularly the anniversary issues? Is that what you're doing?
Well, sometimes, yes, because it's kind of like...
Is that the reason why you purchased this one in particular?
Yes, because it was the 30th anniversary. At that time, comic book fans during the 90s, they were really interested to see what the writers were going to do to these characters, since they've now been 30 years old. If you had a child who was in his 60s and now he was in his 30s, in the 90s, and they find out what they're doing to Iron Man, they will want to be interested because, hey, it's been 30 years. It's like, have you ever seen any of the Marvel or DC cartoon shows, like the Super Friends and all that? Wouldn't be interested to know like what they've been doing for the past couple of years since the show finished.
Before we came on to the second part here,
sure,
you told me we were going to discuss of how the comics associate to movies and film. Well, could you fill us in with that?
Sure. So during the 60s and 70s, the comics were becoming really iconic pop culture within the American community, and as well as almost the whole entire world, because comics, they were back way back as in the 1880s when they started, but they were just like little small comic strips. They were either used for comedy or for political jokes, which we still use today. But then during the 1910s, someone thought, hey, let's try and put some more art to it. Let's try and create some stories. And by the 1910s, they had all these amazing stories.
So, how did did they start out as the cartoon comic strips that we see in the newspaper?
Yes.
Is that how the comic books started?
Last time I checked, yes.
Okay.
So anyway, like you're wondering how did they associate, like how did they change the film industry? Well, once the 1960s were over and space was becoming very popular, the Western movies were kind of dying down. So the film industry was trying to think of ideas or ways to bring back their industries because they were starting to get concerned with, like, since the Westerns are dying
How
down
to
in
recreate
space.
things, yeah.
Yeah. And some of these directors who were creating movies were like, hey, I know, how about we trade, let's say, like, I was a kid, I remember seeing this cartoon show, Superman, let's try and bring them in live action. And you got Superman, the one that came out in the 1970s. Then after that, during the late 1980s, during the 1960s, Batman was actually one of the first popular live action superheroes.
I remember that.
You know,
I
no,
remember that. It was so good.
Yeah, and Adam West and his partner were really amazing. They did a pretty good job. Some comic book fans will say, oh, he was not the real Batman. But it's kind of funny because during the 1950s and 60s, Batman was actually kind of humorous. He was kind of calm, funny. He was like meant for kids. And what they thought of doing was, let's try and bring that into a TV show because, hey, that would be interesting, having some characters. So that's when live action was becoming, the comic books for film industries were becoming very popular because not only was it these characters you were seeing, but you were seeing the well-known actors who did a lot of famous movies portraying as these characters when you were a kid reading them. So that brought in a lot of money for the film industry as well as for the comics.
I remember Batman was one of the first one. Then we had Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And what other ones did we have?
Batman, the original Flash, not the one with the red suit, but one that looked like he had a spaghetti helmet on him.
Captain America.
Then there's Captain America as well, yes.
Yeah, you can tell I watched a lot of these programs. Okay, tell us about this Spider-Man.
Now, this is an interesting Spider-Man. That is it's not Peter Parker, it's Miguel, I believe his name is pronounced.
Okay.
And he is in the year 2099. It came out in the 1990s. This right here is kind of a reprint version that came out in the late 2010s. And the reason for that is because Miguel, at the beginning of the 1990s, he was very popular. Marvel thought, hey, let's go into the future. Since it's the 90s, what will the future look like in the 2090s? And so they had Spider-Man 2099, X-Men 2099, even Punisher 2099. And all these characters were really interesting. They were different characters, but they were trying to follow their predecessors. What made Miguel very popular again was because of one video game, and that was Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, that came out in 2010. The game focuses not only on Peter Parker, but also multiverses of Peter Parker and a different character. You had Spider-Man Nayor, you had Ultimate Spider-Man, and then finally they brought back was Spider-Man 2099 because he was actually a cool guy. He had his suit was more nanotechnology than latex, the stretchy kind. And so his suit was kind of like a living, breathing armor that could be repaired easily.
I'm curious.
Sure.
Okay. In here, is that like all the regular comic books? Are they all scripted and the same with the pictures and whatever?
Sometimes yes, other times no, but they still have the same storyline.
But what I'm saying is, do they have chapters of just stories, written words,
Yes.
or a lot of pictures? Because I find that this is pretty thick.
Well, that's the interesting thing is pictures with words, as you call it. The comic book it has tons of Spider-Man 2099 comics, and it's really interesting because this is volume 1. It has tons of it. When you have volume 1, it's almost like a year of the comic.
I see. So it's a compiled version
Yes.
of that particular year. So this would be considered another anniversary edition. Is that
Yes.
great? Okay, well, let's go on to this before we run out of time.
Of course.
Okay, Spider-Man again.
Yes. Now that was kind of like a special edition. It was for collectors as well. You can see how it was made, and in fact, you can actually feel the words as well.
Beautiful.
And it's kind of another story of Spider-Man 2099. Some of these comics I will open just to read them. Other times I'll just leave them alone because I don't want them to get damaged.
I see that. What do you read them with a tweezer very carefully?
No, if I do that, that actually ruins the page as well because they're like, hey, what are these little holes right here?
Okay,
Yes.
let's do this one.
Now that's another famous Marvel character that a lot of comic book fans know about. That right there is the Man-Thing. It's another Marvel character. He's a superhero actually, but he's actually a monster as well. It's kind of one of Marvel's paranormal superheroes. And what he does is he protects the swamps from those who try to harm it.
Huh.
Yeah, back in those times it was kind of odd, but now looking at it, it's actually kind of pretty neat because of how the creativity of the artist as well as the writer made and came up with this character.
This is
the first issue of it.
This is a pretty old one. Okay, we're gonna have to go through these because
Sure.
we're running out of time like pretty
Then
quick.
there's
So
Spider-Woman. This is her first comic book. Her first issue was when she was trying to attack Nick Fury, but Nick Fury was able to convince her that she can join S.H.I.E.L.D. instead of working for Hydra. So in this issue, she decides to become a superhero.
okay.
Then these two right here are my more modern comics. The Predator from the 1980s movie. It's kind of an updated version. It has a really good story. It's considered one of the best Predator comic stories.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Sorry if the image kind of a little bit grosses you out.
No.
And then this is a recent one. It's kind of a lot of Nickelodeon fans have been waiting for. The return of Invader Sim. They decided to return him by having his own comic book.
This is interesting. I see this one's been open. Could we kind of open it a little
Yeah,
bit
of
to
course.
see inside?
Definitely.
I'm so afraid to open this.
No, don't worry. This is new, so right now it's not that valuable.
Okay.
But it is a great story.
But I just don't want to spoil it.
No, it's okay.
It's very interesting. Okay,
No.
and this is
This is the last one, which is very special.
the
I found
end of the
this.
nitty gritty here.
Superman versus Spider-Man. This was the first time you see two famous characters from different comic books coming together, where you have Superman and Spider-Man fighting each other.
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're both heroes. So how?
Well, it's,
What were they fighting about?
Well, it's actually an interesting story. When Spider-Man is able to lock up Dr. Octopus, or Doc Ock as he calls him, much to the annoyance of Dr. Octopus, he soon meets this other criminal that was put up by another superhero, aka Superman, and the villain's name is Lex Luthor. They soon realize they have both a common goal, which was to take over the world. So they come together into making Superman look like a bad guy by using a hologram, making it look like Superman kidnapped not only Lois Lane, but Mary Jane as well. And Spider-Man, he was there at the time, thought that that was actually Superman. So he finally comes face to face with Superman and they have a big fight. But in the end, Superman beats him and reveals that what was really going on. So they team up together to stop not only Dr. Octopus, but Lex Luthor as well, in a space station.
So how does it end up? Give us the end of the story because
Okay.
we're gonna have to go pretty soon.
Oh, sure. As they say in the comic book and film industry, spoiler alert, sorry, if you want to skip now, just quickly skip. But the way how it ends is that they are able to save both Mary Jane and Lois Lane. They both agree that they are both heroes and they respect each other, and they go on their separate ways. Oh, and they put up Lex Luthor and Dr. Octopus, but not in the same person, but separate. Lex Luthor goes back to Metropolis, while Dr. Octopus is finally put in a high security prison in New York.
Well, John, I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been having you on the program
You too.
because you're an excellent speaker and you're very eloquent, you're very knowledgeable,
Oh, thank you.
and I'm telling you, the next professor in comic books and next historian. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy this program.
Have a great day.
Take care. Bye-bye.